Great, thank you, Hans, and thank you very much to the IEA DSM for inviting me to present here at the webinar today, and thank you also for all the attendees for your interest in the work of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, on energy efficiency. My name's Joe Ritchie and I work in the Energy Efficiency Division at the IEA, and I project manage our Energy Efficiency Market Report, which is referred to last year as Energy Efficiency 2017. So this is the report that I'll be talking about today. I'll be highlighting some of the key results and some of the key findings from this report. But the report itself presents information on energy efficiency trends and indicators. We talk about some of the drivers for gains and improvements in energy efficiency. And we also talk about energy efficiency in the key end-use sectors of buildings, industry and transport. And we also talk about efficiency, investment, finance and markets, an important and growing driver. And in last year's report we had a special chapter that looked at energy efficiency in Indonesia, which is the largest energy user in Southeast Asia. And unlike some other IEA reports, the Energy Efficiency 2017 publications and all the preceding publications are actually free to download, and you can get that from www.iea.org/efficiency. So if you're interested, I encourage you to go to the website and download the report, because there's a lot more information in the report than what I'm able to go through today. But what I'll be going through is some of the key findings and highlights from the report. And to start with, I'm going to talk about some of the global energy efficiency trends and indicators that we highlight in the report. So at the IEA, the key metric that we use to present a global picture of energy efficiency is the change in global energy intensity. And we define global energy intensity as primary energy per unit of global GDP. And what we do is we look at the year-on-year change in that global energy intensity. And obviously a negative change means that the world has become more energy efficient and is using less energy to deliver the services that it otherwise would. So you can see that before 2010, that global primary energy intensity improved at an average rate of about 1.3%. You can see that from the left-hand side of this graph. If you look across to the right-hand side, you can see that since 2010, that the rate of global energy intensity improvements have actually taken a step up. In fact, since 2010, the average rate of global annual energy intensity improvements has been around 2.1%. So that's almost double what it was prior to 2010. Now in 2016, the rate was slightly lower than the average of this decade, but still in line with this step up in the rate of global energy intensity improvement. In terms of what the improvements in global energy intensity actually mean, well, one of the biggest impacts that we highlight in our report has been on energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. And one thing that the IEA highlighted is that, as you can see from this graph, between 1970 and up to 2010, global energy-related CO2 emissions were increasing as a result of increasing economic activity. But between 2014 and 2016, global emissions were flat. And so one question that we wanted to ask and answer in our report last year is what has actually been the factors that have led to this flattening in global energy-related CO2 emissions? Well, what we found is that there are three key factors. The first of those is GDP growth. So the GDP of the global economy grew at an average rate of about 3% between 2014 and 2016. And that GDP growth put upward pressure on global emissions. But then there were two factors that offset that impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The first of those is changes in the global energy mix, specifically the movement away from coal and oil towards renewable energy and gas for electricity generation. But the other and more important impact was improvements in energy intensity. In fact, improvements in energy intensity actually offset 75% of the impact of GDP on greenhouse gas emissions and resulted in this flattening trend that we have seen between 2014 and 2016. So a big benefit there for the environment from improvements in energy intensity. But one thing that people will know is that improvements in energy intensity are influenced by a lot of factors, not just energy efficiency. This includes factors such as changes in economic structure, away from more energy-intensive industrial operations towards less energy-intensive services operations, as well obviously as changes in the global fuel mix. So at the IEA, what we do is undertake decomposition analysis to remove the impacts of economic structure and get a better understanding about what the actual impact of energy efficiency has been on global energy use. And we do this in the Energy Efficiency 2017 report for IEA member countries, of which there are now 30, and major emerging economies. And these major emerging economies are China, India, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, and Russia. But first of all, if we look at IEA member countries, we actually see that if it wasn't for improvements in energy efficiency since 2000, energy use, final energy use in IEA member countries would have been higher than it was in 2016. However, what we actually found as a result of our decomposition analysis was that energy use in 2016 in IEA member countries was actually lower than it was in 2000, which means that because of energy efficiency improvements since 2000, IEA member countries as a whole are now using less energy than they were in 2000, and energy use is now at levels that it has not been since the 1990s. For the major emerging economies, it's a much different story. The large amount of economic activity and development has seen energy use rise quite a bit, but again, without energy efficiency, that energy use rise would have been even greater. In the major emerging economies that we analysed, energy efficiency avoided an additional 13% more energy use. And combined for the world as a whole, energy efficiency improvements since 2000 have actually avoided an additional 12% more energy use. And to put that in context, if those energy efficiency improvements hadn't been added, the world would have an additional European Union as part of its global energy mix. So it's a substantial benefit from energy efficiency. We can take the energy savings and then, based on fuel mix, convert those to emissions abatements and emissions reductions. And so what we can see here from the graph on the left is the trends in global greenhouse gas emissions from 2000 to 2016. The dark blue line shows the actual trends in emissions, and we can see that between 2014 and 2016 there was that flattening in emissions that I talked about earlier in the presentation. But these emissions have been the result of improvements in energy efficiency. Looking at the lighter blue dashed line, we actually see what the emissions would have potentially been had it not been for improvements in energy efficiency. They would have actually been 12.5% higher in 2016, and we would not have seen that flattening in emissions that we have witnessed between 2014 and 2016. And when we look at the contribution to emissions abatement from improvements in energy efficiency, we see that historically IEA member countries have had the lion's share of that abatement. We see that from the dark blue shaded area on the graph on the right. But that major emerging economies, as shown by the light blue shaded area, are actually increasing their contribution. And in fact, in 2016, major emerging economies were responsible for about 47% of the total global emissions abatement from improvements in energy efficiency, compared to IEA member countries that were only responsible for 45% of the abatement. And the major reason for this ramp up is because of reductions in coal use, particularly within the Chinese industrial sector. So major emerging economies are starting to play a much bigger role in the impacts from energy efficiency improvement. Now all of these messages are at a very high, all of economy, global level. But energy efficiency benefits very much do extend down to individual households and individual consumers. In the Energy Efficiency 2017 report, we analysed this by looking at the household energy expenditure savings in 2016 that were the result of energy efficiency improvements since 2000. And when we talk about household energy expenditure savings, we're talking here about the energy used for things like heating and cooking and cooling, and also the energy used to power the family car. And what we see here is that if it was not for energy efficiency improvements since 2000, that household expenditure per capita in Germany on energy would have been $580 higher, with a similar percentage increase in expenditure we believe would have happened in France and the United Kingdom and Japan. And so all those benefits and that avoided expenditure results from improvements in energy efficiency of household appliances and vehicles. And even in emerging economies like China, where the demand for energy services is still growing, they have still avoided paying an additional 25% more on their household energy and travel, their household energy and travel costs as a result of improvements in energy efficiency. So it's of great benefit also to individual households. And another important strategic benefit of energy efficiency that we examined in the 2017 report was the benefits of energy efficiency to energy security. And the major benefit is that improvements in energy efficiency reduce the need for economies to import additional oil, gas or coal in order to satisfy their domestic energy demand. And for a couple of major importing countries, we were able to estimate what the avoided additional imports would have been as a result of improvements in energy efficiency since 2000. So looking at gas imports via the graph on the left, we can see that in Japan and the United Kingdom, that they would have avoided a similar amount of additional physical imports of gas because of improvements in end uses like space heating or industrial gas use. But an interesting observation is that for the UK, because of the fact that they have a larger amount of their domestic gas demand that is satisfied by their own resources, is that if it wasn't for energy efficiency improvements, they would have actually had to import 80% more gas to satisfy their domestic demand. When we turn our attention to oil, we see, and as shown in the graph on the right, we see that Japan, because of its very long-lived vehicle fuel efficiency policies and their very high reliance on imports, that they have avoided an additional 20% more oil imports as a result of improvements in energy efficiency, and that exceeds about 1.6 exajoules worth of oil. And across all members of the IEA, which encapsulate all the major energy importing countries, we estimate that if it was not for energy efficiency improvements since 2000, that IEA member countries would have had to collectively spend nearly US $50 billion more on their energy imports in 2016. So that's a major benefit to energy security and also to trade balances. That's a very long-term energy intensity, energy security story, but energy efficiency also improves short-term energy security. And in the Energy Efficiency 2017 report, we focused specifically on short-term gas security in Europe, which is a key market for gas imports. And as some of you may know, within the European Union, member states have to abide by what is referred to as the N-1 supply requirement. And what this supply requirement means is that all European Union member countries have to have access to enough gas such that if a major pipeline or a major gas storage facility was to go offline, that they would still be able to meet their daily historic peak gas demand. And what we did here is look at the three major European gas markets, Germany, the United Kingdom and France. And you can see from this graph, from the dark blue shaded area, this is the historic daily peak gas demand. And the green bar is the amount of daily supply that those countries have available to meet their N-1 supply requirement. So you can see that in Germany they have a lot of gas supply and meet their N-1 supply requirement quite nicely. In the UK and in France they meet that supply requirement but to a lesser extent. But the question was, and what we look to answer, is how has energy efficiency contributed to these countries being able to meet their N-1 supply requirement? And what you see here in the light blue shaded area is what the additional peak daily gas demand would have been had it not been for improvements in energy efficiency. And these improvements were primarily due to improved space heating, which dictates, in many cases, the gas peak demand during the winter months within Europe. And so what you see here, that in Germany, without energy efficiency improvements, they would have still met their N-1 supply requirements, but it would have been less comfortable. And in the UK and France, we can see that if it wasn't for energy efficiency improvements, that they would actually have not met their N-1 supply requirements with their current gas supply infrastructure. And that is because, as you can see, the light blue shaded area actually goes above their current amount of daily gas supply that meets their N-1 requirement. And so they would have actually needed to build additional pipelines or additional gas infrastructure in order to meet their short-term energy security requirements. That's another good indicator about the benefits of energy efficiency to energy security. Turning now to some of the trends that we analysed for energy efficiency in the key sectors of industry, buildings and transport. And I start here with industry. And for industry, again, we looked at industrial energy intensity for IEA member economies and major emerging economies. Looking at IEA member economies first, on the left-hand side, we can see some trends. First of all, for industrial energy use, which has been decreasing, and industry gross value added, which represents the value of the outputs of the products that industry produces. That has actually been increasing, and because value added has been increasing and energy use has been decreasing, the energy intensity of the industry sector in IEA member countries has improved by about 30%. When we turn our attention to the major emerging economies, as we see in the graph on the right, we see a different story. Gross value added, as represented by the light blue line, has grown almost linearly since 2000. Very strong growth. There has also been growth in energy use, but that has not been to the same rate. Particularly, we have seen energy use and gross value added grow at much different rates since about 2006. And that difference in growth rates represents also a 30% improvement in energy intensity within these major emerging economies. Now, in terms of the important factors that are actually driving this change in energy use, it's very much linked to China, which is home to the world's largest energy industry sector. Now, in China, in 2006, the government introduced its 11th five-year plan. And in this 11th five-year plan, China, for the first time ever, put in place mandatory energy intensity targets for its largest 1,000 industrial and commercial enterprises. This was referred to as the Top 1,000 program, and it forced companies to implement measures to improve energy efficiency. With their 12th five-year plan, which they released in 2011, the Chinese government expanded the Top 1,000 program to be the Top 10,000 program, such that the largest 10,000 enterprises in China had to improve their energy intensity. And as a result, that led to a much stronger reduction or change in the rate of energy use growth, and has obviously been a key factor driving that difference in trends and driving that improvement in industrial energy intensity. But policy is not the sole factor why industrial energy intensity has been improving. Another factor has been the rate at which new production facilities have been built for some energy-intensive industry sectors. And in the Energy Efficiency 2017 report, we looked here specifically at the energy intensity of primary aluminium smelting, which is a very electricity-intensive industrial process. And what we see here is the trends for energy intensity for aluminium smelting between 2000 and 2016. Looking firstly at Europe and North America, the light blue and dark blue lines at the top of the chart, we can see that because there has not been a lot of new production capacity built since 2000, that the energy intensity of these countries' aluminium sectors has remained at a reasonably constant level. However, there are two country groupings where we're seeing much more new production and therefore much more different trends in terms of energy intensity. The first of those is what is referred to as GCC, which is the Gulf Coast Cooperation Council, which is countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, where new aluminium production capacity has been constructed as a result of access to very cheap gas, which can be used for electricity generation. And we can see here that when the first plant started to come online in 2009, that the region already had lower energy intensity than Europe and North America. And then that lower energy intensity has continued on since 2009 out to 2016. But even more profound is the trend in China. In China, because of the ability for aluminium plants to source cheap electricity from hard coal, and also because of the strong demand for aluminium products within China, there has been a lot of new production capacity built. And that new production capacity is the most efficient in the world, and that has led to the global energy intensity of aluminium smelting actually reducing by about 7% between 2000 and 2016. And it is due primarily to the new facilities that have been built in China and also in the Middle East. A major means by which some industrial companies are able to improve their energy efficiency, and a way which is recognised by policymakers, is by the adoption of energy management systems. So for those who don't know, energy management systems encapsulate the systems and processes and protocols that an industrial or commercial firm implements in order to manage its energy use, to systematically identify and assess and make decisions about projects to improve energy efficiency. And since 2011, the global standard for an energy management system has been ISO 50001. And through this standard, we were able to get an understanding about how common and how widespread the adoption of energy management systems has become. When we look at the graph on the left, we see the distribution of energy management systems by country and region. We see that Europe represents about 85% of the total ISO 50001 certifications at the end of 2016, of which there were just under 12,000. And when we look at the graph on the right, we see that Germany is by far the largest country for ISO 50001 certified companies. And the reason why it is so high in Germany is because the German government has implemented some very powerful tax incentives for companies to implement an energy management system, such that companies, if they implement ISO 50001, are able to have a reduction in their tax bill, and that's been a very powerful motivator for implementation. And whilst it's early days, we are seeing that energy management systems are producing some very positive benefits for industrial companies. This data here has been taken from the United States, from the Superior Energy Performance Program, And we can see that for companies that have implemented ISO 50001, that they are achieving above business as usual energy and cost savings. And bringing in not only these results, but other results from case studies, we are finding that early evidence is suggesting that companies that have implemented ISO 50001 and similar energy management systems are achieving savings of around 10% per year. So very positive early results there. Looking now at the building sector, and we see here the trends of energy use in the building sector from 2010. What we can see here is that energy use within the building sector is actually increasing very slightly, and the actual shares of energy use within the building sector based on appliances has been reasonably constant. But there is this slight increase in building energy use. And the reason for that is when we look at the orange line at the bottom of the graph, this is the energy intensity reduction. So this is energy use per unit of floor area within buildings and how much that has been reducing since 2010. It's reducing at about a rate of 1.5%. However, because of the new additions of building floor space, new residential buildings, new commercial offices, that actual floor area is growing at a rate of about 2%. And it's because that floor area growth is exceeding building energy intensity reductions, that is why we're seeing energy use continue to grow within the building sector. And if we want energy use to fall, then intensity reductions need to exceed floor area growth. For the transport sector, the key factor that has influenced energy efficiency here in recent years has been the oil price. What you see here is the change in the oil price for OECD countries between 2000 and 2016, and it's pretty clear there's been a big fall in the oil price. And now what that has meant is that individual customers or individual consumers within the vehicle market are actually making different choices in relation to what type of vehicles they would buy. So previously, a consumer might have been not inclined to buy, say, a large SUV or a large truck because they would not have been able to afford or would not thought that they could have afforded the cost of running the vehicle because it has a higher oil consumption or higher petrol consumption. However, as a result of the fall in energy prices, we have seen an increase in the amount of new SUVs and new large passenger vehicles that are being purchased in major vehicle markets. You can actually see that trend here between 2014 to 2016, and it's actually most profound in Asia, where the sales of vans, SUVs and pickups has increased by 24% in Japan, 25% in Korea and 27% in China. It's the highest rate of increase globally, and obviously this rate of increase in large passenger vehicle sales corresponds to the fall in the oil price that I showed on the previous slide. So now turning our attention to energy efficiency, investment, finance and markets, which obviously fund and drive many of these trends. And in the Energy Efficiency 2017 report, we estimated that the global investment in energy efficiency increased by 9% to reach $231 billion. What we see here is that China is the region where energy efficiency investment grew the fastest. That is shown by the graph on the left. And then when we look to the pie chart on the right, we see that it is the building sector that dominates global energy efficiency investment, representing more than half of the total investment. Taking a bit of a deeper look at the building sector, we actually see that the building envelope, so that includes things like insulation, double glazing windows, and other weatherization or other improvements to the building envelope, carries the lion's share of investment within the building sector. But the fastest growing source of investment within buildings energy efficiency is actually for energy efficient lighting and that's because of the growing uptake of LED lighting, which, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the most energy efficient form of lighting and is actually supported by some government programs in major emerging economies. The other key market that we look to estimate the size of is the Global Energy Service Company, or ESCO market. For those who don't know, an ESCO is a company that provides an energy efficiency service, say implementing an energy efficiency project under an energy performance contract. There's multiple ways in which those contracts work, but broadly speaking, that's how we define an ESCO. And in 2016, we estimated that the global ESCO market grew to reach $26.8 billion US, with China by far the largest global ESCO market. The reason for China being so large is that in the past there have been some very favourable incentives provided to companies to actually implement an energy efficiency project through an ESCO. What happened is that the Chinese government would actually double the financial savings that a company would get from an energy efficiency project that was implemented through an ESCO. And that was obviously very powerful at driving growth within the Chinese ESCO market. The other major and very important driver of energy efficiency gains globally is energy efficiency policy. And the key policy that we track at the IEA is mandatory energy efficiency policy, and this includes things like minimum energy performance standards for appliances, fuel efficiency standards for cars, and also mandatory industrial energy efficiency policies such as China's Top 1000 and Top 10,000 program. And we look at, to get an understanding about how widespread mandatory energy efficiency policy is, we look at the amount of global energy use that is covered by mandatory energy efficiency policy. In 2016, over 31% of global energy use was subject to a mandatory energy efficiency code or standard. The largest sector was the non-residential building sector, followed by industry. And in industry, we can actually see from the light blue bar that China was responsible for the lion's share of industry mandatory energy efficiency policy, and that is because of its Top 10,000 program. And similarly, we're seeing growth in residential buildings and also in transport, but it is not as profound as it was in the industry sector. We also look at coverage on the basis of major end use, and we can see that because of the number of lighting energy efficiency policies, and that lighting turns over and old lights are replaced much quicker than other appliances, that nearly 80% of global lighting energy use is subject to a mandatory efficiency policy. Cars, passenger cars, are coming just over 50%. That is because of long-lived policies in major markets like the US and Japan. We see similar coverage in electric motors and space heating. And interestingly, and I'll talk about this more in a few slides' time, that even though cars are quite strong, trucks actually have quite low coverage. And as a world total, as I said, there's about 31% of global energy use that's covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies, but about 68% of this energy use remains uncovered. Now, there are two factors that drive growth in the coverage of mandatory efficiency codes and standards. The first of those is existing policies. So this represents policies, say for appliance standards, that were introduced since 2000. And as old energy-using appliances are replaced by new appliances that are subject to a mandatory efficiency code or standard, that energy use and that coverage growth drives an expansion in the amount of energy use that is covered by mandatory codes and standards. The other factor that drives a growth in coverage is new policies. And from this graph here, we actually see what has been the contributing factor to growth in mandatory efficiency codes and standards and the amount of energy use that is covered by those standards. What we find is that historically existing policies are the major contributor, but that in 2016 existing policies were almost responsible for all of the growth in coverage of mandatory efficiency codes and standards. There is very little coverage from new policies. And it's also important to realise that policy strength is the other factor behind mandatory energy efficiency policy that is an important contributor to how effective energy efficiency policy can be. And so by strength, we mean things like how low the energy use or how low the energy intensity of an appliance has to be in order for it to be sold into the market. And when we talk about increases in policy strength, we refer here to how often mandatory energy efficiency policies have been revised or amended in order to make them stronger, in order to make them more strenuous and stringent in terms of, for example, what appliances can be sold on the market. And so what we also see here is that in 2016, from the bar on the top, is that the strength of mandatory efficiency policies also grew at a much slower rate than it had in previous years. And this is tending to indicate maybe a slowdown in the rate of new energy efficiency policy implementation. I want to make sure we get time for questions, so I will maybe just go through the last slides a bit quicker. So what we do at the IEA is develop what we have called an Efficiency Policy Progress Index, or EPI, and this EPI combines increases in policy coverage and policy strength to give an indication about how much mandatory energy efficiency policy has actually progressed since 2000. From this graph here, when you look at the far right, you can see that China has shown by far the most progress on energy efficiency policy, and that on a time basis, most progress on energy efficiency policy has been made since between 2011 and 2015, and that's again because of more stock turnover of energy using appliances and new policies in China. When we look at additions to policy progress each year, we again see a trend that indicates that there has been a slowdown, or there is a slowdown in the implementation of new energy efficiency policy, and that is that when we look at the incremental policy progress each year, that in 2016, as you see from the bar on the far right, that policy progress grew by the slowest it has since 2010, and that existing policies for the first time were responsible for the policy progress as opposed to new policies. And so what we concluded from this in Energy Efficiency 2017 was that we needed to see, that we believed we were seeing a slowdown in the implementation of new energy efficiency policy, and as a result, a potential risk for the continuation of all the benefits from energy efficiency that we had observed earlier on. And one thing that we get asked about is obviously, well, what actions can governments take on energy efficiency? Where can they make improvements? And one of the major areas where we see there as being a need for improved policy is in trucks. And what you see here is a forecast from the IEA's World Energy Outlook about CO2 emissions growth for trucks in the red bar at the bottom, and for emissions from coal use in the power sector and the industry sector globally between 2015 and 2050. What you actually see is that without any new policy implementation, that the CO2 emissions from trucks will actually exceed the CO2 emissions from the use of coal for electricity generation and within the industry sector. So it's going to be a very important driver of the energy system into the future, and an important driver of emissions. But as I mentioned a few slides ago, when we look at energy efficiency policy coverage, what we actually find is that it is very much two-speed within the transport sector. For passenger cars, nearly 40 countries have fuel efficiency standards, with North America having a large number of standards, or the largest coverage of standards, because it is a very large vehicle market. But for trucks, only 4 countries, China, the USA, Japan and Canada, have fuel efficiency standards for trucks. And that is obviously a statistic that, given the expected growth in truck energy use, that we would need to see rise into the future. So that brings me to the end of the highlights that I wanted to talk about today. A couple of concluding remarks from the Energy Efficiency 2017 report. We do show that energy efficiency is very important to the global economy, to households and the environment. We are seeing a step up in efficiency gains since 2010, and that is obviously having many positive impacts. But we are seeing a potential slowdown in the implementation of new energy efficiency policy, and so therefore we want to see governments redirect their attention to attacking the remaining 68% of energy use that is not covered by mandatory energy efficiency policies. And at the IEA, we see our role as being able to provide analysis and advice that helps countries realise their unmet energy efficiency potential. And we do that by training policymakers, facilitating knowledge exchange, and, as I said, providing advice. So that's all I had for the presentation today, but obviously there's some time for questions, Hans, if we want.